Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going to dive into a topic that I really have not covered on this channel, and that is the Vietnam War. Honestly, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there just aren't as many videos out there on some of the channels that we tend to look at about the Vietnam War. And number two, I think as we get a little closer to history, this is close enough in the collective memory that it can be a touchy subject for some people, especially because it was a war in which the United States obviously played a major role. We forget that there were a lot of other players too, and collectively speaking, the United States had relatively few casualties compared to the other players in this war, even though it was significant from our standpoint. So a lot of people were opposed to this war, and the troops kind of took the brunt of some of that, got called a lot of pretty nasty things, were treated very poorly, even though many of them had been drafted. I'm sure we'll get into all of that, but that is to say, we're going to take a look at a channel that we first explored a week or so ago, and that is Things I Care About. He makes no pretension to not be modeled after Oversimplified. He acknowledges that up front, that's kind of his inspiration, and you see a lot of that. So I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. But let's go ahead and dive into the Vietnam War, Part 1.
This is 19th century Vietnam, a feudal state with a butt ton of valuable natural resources. Hey Vietnam, do you mind if we colonize you and steal all your resources? The Vietnamese did mind, but the French colonized them anyways.
So this is a time in history when the focus of these European colonial powers has shifted away from places like South America and is now focused on Africa and Southeast Asia, the Pacific. And so you have countries like France, Germany, Britain, even Belgium and others, Italy, getting in on what can we grab, primarily because it's an opportunity. As you're growing and you're this massive industrial power, you need a lot of natural resources, and the cheaper you can acquire those, the better.
France went to the powerful landowners and was like, how about you
Monopoly
keep your power
guy.
and privileges, but you help us keep everyone under control. This was a sweet deal for the French, who got rich of Vietnamese resources, but the Vietnamese people benefited very little.
So you have a couple of choices when you're one of these colonial powers half a world away. You can send a massive military presence to try and keep order and conquer the people and then hold on to what you've conquered. Or you try to do it in a different way. You get local people on the ground, people who are a part of that culture, that nation, that language, and you buy them off and you get their loyalty and they run the show for you. Of course, that makes them particularly unpopular, but it's one of the ways you can choose to do things.
Only 25% of them could read, and 90% lived in poverty working for large landowners, French farms or factories. A young Vietnamese called Nguyen Sinh Nguyen thought that this was deeply uncool, and in 1911 left for France to get an education. There he came across the works of Marx and Lenin, who described that in a capitalist system, the landowners and wealthy individuals would team up to systematically oppress the workers and poor farmers, and that powerful capitalist nations relied on the exploitation of the resources from underdeveloped nations to sustain their way of life, and that thus the only way to end imperialism and the colonialism that came with it was to end capitalism itself.
So here you have a perfect storm of timing and information and circumstances. This guy leaves the French conquered Indochina area there, and he goes to France, where he gets a hold of this information that's been written by Karl Marx, who's German and then ends up living in the UK, and he gets this information, and this gives him an alternative idea. And like many situations like this, when you have people wanting to overthrow a government, they're all going to be focused on overthrowing that government, but then what happens once they've thrown off those shackles? Now they're going to fight against each other over what their new system should look like.
This made a lot of sense to young Nguyen, who became a big fan. In 1919, after the end of World War I, he contacted American President Woodrow Wilson's team in Versailles and gave them a petition asking for help in turning Vietnam independent. The request was ignored.
No, you're not a white European. I don't care about you. That's pretty much his idea. Now, 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is not just about simply bringing the Great War to an end. It's also about what comes next, and it's about reshaping the world. And for guys like Wilson, the idea of self-determination is something that's important to him. And so you would think, on the surface at least, that Vietnamese people wanting self-determination would be something he would support, but not so much.
At the same time, independence movements were growing in Vietnam. Although they were led by the Communist Party, they had wide support from people who wished to see a free Vietnam. In 1930,
like I said earlier, I mean, you don't have to agree with the ideology of the people who are fighting for freedom, because right now you agree on what matters most to you, which is independence. We can fight about what independence looks like later. Right now, we just need to get there.
Workers at a Michelin plant in Fujian went on strike to protest their terrible working conditions.
Is it the Michelin Man? And the French with a baguette, of course.
The French brutally crushed the strike and executed the leaders by guillotine.
Yeah, the last French execution by guillotines in 1977, the year I was born. And I believe, was it Christopher Lee, the actor, actually witnessed it?
The movement was interrupted when Mustache Man decided to invade
Mustache
Poland and
Man.
then France, which severely limited France's ability to manage its colonial empire. Yoink said Japan immediately taking over Vietnam and its resources. Although they too were brutal in their occupation, the Japanese victory over the French sent a clear message. The Europeans were not invincible. Wen returned to Vietnam and took on the name Ho Chi Minh. He then founded the League for an Independent Vietnam, or
I didn't realize that was Ho Chi Minh we were talking about there. Now it makes a little more sense.
Viet Minh for short, and soon began guerrilla warfare against the Japanese occupiers.
So this is interesting because, you know, typically when you hear about or when you tell the story of the Vietnam War, it typically starts with 1954 with the fall of Dien Bien Phu. But as we often say on this channel, everything's connected. And so you, as I mentioned, and I think it was in yesterday's video, you always have to decide, where do we start the story, understanding that no matter where you start the story, there's a backstory to that too. And 1954 being a starting point, this is all so far just giving us the backstory to how we get to Dien Bien Phu, which is when the French are going to be driven off. And you can see here that they're learning how to fight against a colonizing power, fighting against the Japanese during World War II, because the Japanese are obviously facing the Allies, and they've got a lot of other things going on besides just dealing with Vietnam.
Who is this? I'm the OSS. The what? The predecessor to the CIA? Oh, you should have just said that. Listen, I heard you're fighting the Japanese.
Office of Strategic Services.
We are fighting the Japanese too. Wouldn't it be like super cool if we fought them together? How do I know I can trust you? I'll give you tons of weapons.
I feel like this is foreshadowing pretty much the story of the 20th century. You know, give weapons to the enemy of your enemy, not realizing down the road that that enemy of your enemy is going to become your enemy as well, and use some of those same weapons against you.
You son of a bee. I'm in. The OSS supplied the Viet Minh with weapons, munitions, food, and medical supplies.
Give
and
them
promised
McDonald's
that the US
fries.
would later support an independent Vietnam. The fighting was devastating for the Vietnamese, and
We'll support an independent Vietnam as long as that independent Vietnam is not communist.
in late 1945, Japanese appropriation of rice farms, accompanied by floods and poor weather conditions, led to a terrible famine that caused the death of between 1 and 2 million
Oh my
Vietnamese.
gosh, I didn't know that either. And that's just, I mean, we're only a couple of decades away from millions more dying in the Vietnam War.
The Viet Minh did their best to help, often stealing food from the occupiers and distributing it among the starving villagers, saving countless people and gaining incredible amounts of support.
There you go.
After Japan surrendered, Vietnam was
There's that very famous picture of MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito.
finally free.
So on September 2nd, Ho declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He was reportedly a huge fan of the US, even having a picture of George Washington and a copy of the US Declaration of Independence on his desk. He even sought the advice of an OSS officer in framing the Declaration of Independence. The Vietnamese Declaration begins with, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, Among these are life, liberty, and
It's
the pursuit
identical.
of happiness. Sounds familiar? Wow, that is so moving. You totally made me reconsider my stance on colonialism.
Nope.
Really? No. The moment Allied forces left the country, the French army began retaking Vietnam. They recognized the DRV above the 17th parallel, but demanded it became part of the French Union. Okay, let's agree that Cochin China will get to vote on whether to unite with me or join the French Union. Deal? Deal. What are you doing? Oh, Cochin China is joining the French Union. But we just agreed I have no idea what you're talking about. Negotiations broke down. The Viet Minh wanted nothing short of Vietnamese independence, while the French were unwilling to lose control of their former colony.
So, I mean, this is such a touchy subject for the Allies, obviously, because by 1944 and into 45, it seems as though the Second World War is moving toward Allied victory. And so there's already kind of one eye toward what comes next. And of course, they're eyeing communism as the next threat. You've got the Soviets, and then now you're going to deal with communism in other places like Southeast Asia, and of course in China eventually, and then over in Cuba as well. So on one hand, you'd think, well, the Allies should be all about letting people determine for themselves what kind of government they want, but they also don't really want that. They want the people to have what kind of government they want as long as it's the right kind of government.
By December 1946, violent skirmishes broke out across the border, and the French attempted to reoccupy the north by force. But the north resisted. They had bled and died for independence against the Japanese and were not going to give it up without a fight. Alright boys, the Vietnamese are resisting our occupation, so we need a new approach. Nuke 'em! How about we rebrand the Viet Minh?
It's kind of a playing on the joke of MacArthur wanting to nuke the North Koreans and even the Chinese during the Korean War.
They are communists, right? So we are not colonizing them, we are liberating them from communism and maybe in the process taking all the resources. Can't we just let them be free? I mean, we have already extracted enough resources from them. Don't they have a right to self-determination? Let's go with your idea. The French returned the former Emperor Bao Dai to Vietnam from Hong Kong and recognized him as the leader of the Republic of Vietnam. Bao Dai received support from the upper classes of Vietnam, and the war turned into a civil war. In 1949, Mao Zedong came to power in China. Whatever Vietnam needs and China has, we will provide.
So now you're starting to get into this proxy war. Communist China is going to help North Korea. It's going to help North Vietnam. The Allies, United Nations, are going to be helping South Korea, helping South Vietnam.
He recognized the DRV as an independent country and began sending tons of weapons and munitions to Vietnam and even helped train their fighters. China had its own reasons to help Vietnam. After all, they were seeing an anti-communist crusade just a few miles from its own border, and they were getting a little nervous. For them, defending Vietnam was not just about defending a fellow communist country, it was a matter of national security.
Yeah.
What's that?
And likewise, countries like the United States viewed it the same way, that this was an issue of national security.
Harry Truman is now president of the United States, and he is really scared that communism will take over the world.
This is the fear that the American government has at this time, that it's a domino effect, that if it spreads from China to North Korea to North Vietnam, then it's going to spread to other places, and pretty soon the whole world's going to be taken over by communism.
So he gave Western Europe a bunch of money so that they would depend on them and not the USSR. He then founded NATO and in 1950 joined the war in Korea. Well, if you want me to join your Russia club, you'll have to help me against the Vietnamese. Deal. Truman didn't need much convincing, and by the early 1950s, the US was paying for 80% of the French expenses. American support got to the point that the French Air Force was mostly
Le Hanger.
comprised of American planes.
I actually did not know this. I didn't know the U.S. was funding the French occupation. See, you learn stuff all the time.
The war in Indochina became France's #1 dollar-earning
Wow.
export. But it didn't have to be like this. In 1945 and 46, Ho Chi Minh had written at least 8 letters to President Truman asking for his help in bringing the matter of Vietnamese independence to the United Nations. Despite the fact that Ho Chi Minh and his followers had worked closely with the Americans against Japan, and despite the fact that Ho was much closer to the US than to the USSR, the Americans didn't answer any of the letters and instead sided with the French.
See, this is, hindsight is 2020, but you look back and think, man, how differently might this have gone if the U.S. had supported them? Yes, they are a communist government, but maybe they're a more moderate communist government. Maybe they're one that stays on good terms with the U.S. But of course, that's not the way that the Western allies are thinking right now. It's all about containing the communist threat.
Ho was, after all, a communist, and ho, he had to go. When the war began, the French controlled most of the large cities in South Vietnam, where the rich elites granted them full support. But the Viet Minh controlled the countryside. The war was brutal and bloody, and neither side was making real progress. Hey, how about we talk this out? Okay, but let me ask my mom first. Mom, can I go to peace negotiations with North Vietnam? Well, I don't know. Did you kill all the commies yet? No, but you can go to peace negotiations after you kill the commies, okay? The US threatened to withdraw all economic and military aid if France even negotiated with the Viet Minh, so the French delegation never arrived. Despite American aid, the guerrilla warfare was incredibly costly for the French, and the
United States basically, according to all of this, the United States basically created the situation that resulted in the Vietnam War.
grip on Vietnam loosened year after year. Bao Dai was an absent leader and little more than a French puppet. There was low morale and chronic desertions within South Vietnam's army, and even in France, the conflict was becoming very unpopular. To turn things around, the French came up with a plan to force the Viet Minh into an open battle where they believed the superior military would prevail. In 1953, they airlifted troops to a valley called Dien Bien Phu to cut the communist supply lines. The fighting was so fierce and the losses so terrible that even the Viet Minh began to lose morale. Even if they defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, the Viet Minh knew they couldn't kick the superior French military out of Vietnam, and the French were aware that they could never take control of the countryside. Finally, both sides decided to meet in Geneva to negotiate.
Yeah, because remember, what had been the French policy before World War II was to pay off local leaders to keep things in check. But, of course, all bets are off after the Second World War, and they've thrown out the Japanese. Now they've got people that are ready to keep fighting, and you can't control that.
But they both wanted to be in as good a position as possible on the ground before negotiations started. The Viet Minh gathered their anti-air artillery in the hills around the valley and sieged the base for months. Their camouflaged cannons were incredibly hard for the French to spot, and they harassed the French air supply with virtual impunity. With their forces at Dien Bien Phu cut off from the rest of their army, the French realized that they had put their head into a noose. On March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh began a direct assault. They used their cannons to weaken the French defenses and dug tunnels to get as close as possible before storming the base.
And here's another thing, they're digging tunnels, and this is something else that they're going to be really good at during the Vietnam War.
The Viet Minh took terrible casualties, but slowly they took over the base. The French desperately pleaded to the US for aid, hoping for a direct intervention. President Eisenhower, another firm believer in the domino theory, considered several possibilities to help them.
So this is important to note, is that now you've switched from Democratic leadership from 1933 all the way up until 1951. You've had the Democrats in power, and now you've got a Republican in Eisenhower. But in terms of foreign policy, he's really not that much different than Truman.
Newcomb. Stop suggesting that. Eisenhower considered joining the war, but a military assessment determined that the US would have to commit at least 500,000 military personnel just to stabilize the situation. Knowing that the American public wouldn't support another war in Asia so soon after Korea, he decided against it. After months of fighting, the French surrendered at Dien Bien Phu on May 7th. The next day, negotiations began in Geneva. Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel with a demilitarized zone on both sides. Ho Chi Minh would keep control of the north and Bao Dai of the south. Vietnamese people would have freedom of movement between North and South for 300 days to choose where they wanted to be. Neither North nor South Vietnam could receive outside military help. An international commission comprised of Canada, Poland, and India would supervise elections in 1956 to choose if the Vietnamese people wanted to unify under Ho Chi Minh or Bao Dai. All things considered, the deal was quite good for the French, as it allowed many of its economic interests, such as the Michelin rubber plantation, to continue operating.
That's why the Michelin Man is there.
Minh were disappointed. They wanted a united Vietnam, nothing less. And they had momentum after the victory at Dien Bien Phu. Many of their leaders wished to keep fighting to reach a better deal. Okay, all in favor? I agree. I agree. I agree. We don't agree. Neither the US nor South Vietnam signed the Geneva Accords. The United States even refused to recognize the independence of North Vietnam. While the negotiations were still taking place, the US set up a special paramilitary unit inside Vietnam led by CIA operative Edward Lansdale.
So instead of having what you have in Korea, which is a north that's communist and a south that's democratic, or at least supposed to be, you end up instead with the end result of all of this is that you're going to have a united Vietnam that's communist, and still is.
And their first mission: weaken the North by making as many people as possible migrate south through psychological warfare. The CIA created propaganda slogans and leaflets appealing to the devout Catholic with themes such as Christ has gone to the south and the Virgin Mary has departed from the north. But they didn't stop there. Gather round, everyone! Look what I just found! I hold in my hand an official Viet Minh document detailing the horrors they want to do to all of you. But why is it in English? We all speak Vietnamese. What do you mean in English? I specifically told them to. Damn it, Thomas, you had one job. In the days following this massive campaign, refugee registration to the south tripled. The CIA also infiltrated paramilitary forces in the north, contaminated the oil supply of the bus company of Hanoi to wreck the bus engines, sabotage the railroad, and much more.
Wait, let's look at some of this. Instigated hatred to the Chinese by spreading false stories of horrible abuse. Preyed on Vietnamese superstitions by creating and distributing a fake almanac of astrological predictions. So here's the thing. I am not deeply familiar with all of this backstory to the Vietnam War. So I get the impression, I mean, the theme obviously has been throughout this video that the U.S. is the one that's responsible for this mess. And I'm inclined to believe that's the case, but I would love to hear from some of you who might push back against that a little bit and offer some opposing perspective, because this does feel a little bit like a one-sided perspective, like U.S. and France bad, Ho Chi Minh good. And I know that nothing is that simple, and it's always more complicated than that. So I'd be interested on a little bit more of the backstory of what Ho Chi Minh's doing during all of this time.
Just 4 days before the reunification election, Prime Minister Vo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam issued a statement making it clear that he had no intention of carrying them out. Come on, man, we had an agreement. No, Diem, just like Eisenhower, knew that Ho Chi Minh would easily win any national election. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs, "I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader."
Okay.
So, the Eisenhower administration ensured that Diem postponed the elections as long as possible.
So imagine that. We don't like what the results are going to be, so we're just going to not have the vote.
This was only possible due to the threat of US intervention. Without it, the South could have never refused the elections without being immediately overrun by the Viet Minh armies. The US justified their support for Diem by claiming that elections wouldn't be free, but that didn't really make any sense. Ho was so popular that he didn't need to resort to fraud to win elections, and besides, the United Nations and an international control commission set up by the Geneva Accords had already agreed to supervise the elections. In the end, the elections for unification never took place, and Vietnam remained divided. In the north, the communists implemented land reform and collectivization. They also repressed class enemies, killing several thousand people. Ho Chi Minh later admitted that they had gone too far and gave some of the land back. Still, the
Oops.
reforms were a success. Food production increased by 60% and the economy surpassed its peak under French rule.
Well, yeah, because now the motivation for the economy is to help the people of Vietnam and not to help France.
Also made the party incredibly popular. At the same time, the South was in political turmoil, filled with powerful warlords and religious factions clashing for power. President Eisenhower chose Diem as the man to build South Vietnam around. In 1955, Diem challenged Bao Dai for leadership and heavily rigged the votes. Just go for like 60%, we don't wanna be too obvious. Uh-huh. You promise to be discreet? Yes, absolutely very discreet. No one will suspect a thing. And the winner of the election is Vo Dinh Diem with, 98.2% of the votes. Thank you, what a surprise. I want to thank everyone who totally voted for me, and those who didn't, watch it. No, seriously, I'm coming for you, communist and you. Diem immediately imprisoned 20,000 political opponents, many of whom he inaccurately accused of being communists.
So both sides, you have basically going after their opponents now. They're consolidating power. They're polarizing. There's not a lot of room for differing thought on either side of the border.
And in complete violation of the Geneva Accords, the US sent 350 military men to Saigon to begin building up its military. By 1959, the country was still divided, and Ho Chi Minh and his party really didn't like that. To them, it appeared that the only thing the war had achieved was to replace their French colonizers for American ones. Okay guys, we need to do something about those pesky Americans. We've had enough wars, let us focus on the North first. Let's become prosperous and successful. That will inspire our comrades in the South to join us. Yeah, right. The Americans will never allow it. We all know that they have one goal, to destroy us and everything we believe in. Well, what do you propose then? We go for the South first. We will show them our peaceful ideas and way of life. By force. The Viet Minh went with this guy's idea, and
So now you're making yourself no better than the people that you see as colonizers who have brought their force to bear in all of this.
formed the National Liberation Front, a formal political face for the insurgency they were sponsoring in the South. Their military arm became known
Viet
as
Cong.
the Liberation Army of South Vietnam. President Diem dubbed them Vietnamese Communists, or Viet Cong.
Yep.
The Viet Cong began assassinating Saigon government officials and ambushing government troops. They had so much control over the countryside that they often functioned as a shadow government. To supply their fighters in the south, the North built a massive network
Ho
of
Chi Minh
supply
Trail.
routes that went from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia and into South Vietnam. This was the beginning of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Diem was quickly losing control over South Vietnam.
And this all shows you why eventually the war is going to escalate into actually going in and bombing places in Cambodia, because that's what's happening here. This is one of those wars, and it's hardly the only war like this, but this is one of those wars where there's no clear battle lines, there's no clear borders, there's not front lines and all those sorts of things. It's such a new kind of war for at least for the United States to be fighting in.
The new US President John F. Kennedy increased military aid from 700 to 16,000 military personnel by the time he was assassinated. He also gave them millions of dollars and logistical and Air Force aid that allowed the South Vietnam Army to expand to 200,000 strong. On January 2, 1963, the South attacked a Viet Cong position around the village of Ap Bac and got pummeled. 3 Americans died in the fighting. In the meantime, Diem was becoming increasingly unpopular. He was a devout Catholic and continuously favored pro-Catholic policies, going so far as banning the public display of the flag of other religions.
Wow.
And if this was not bad enough, the law came into effect right on a Buddhist holiday. This led to massive demonstrations which were brutally suppressed, which led
Like,
to
talk about, you've already got a really volatile situation and it's precarious and there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. The last thing you need to be doing is alienating more and more people. And when you start alienate other religious groups, now you've got to deal not only with the political divides, but now you're creating a religious divide that doesn't need to be there.
To even more protests, during which a Buddhist monk immolated himself.
Yep.
Diem's sister-in-law, who had the role of First Lady, openly mocked the dead monk. Let them burn and we shall clap our hands. If the Buddhists wish to have another barbecue, I will be glad to supply the gasoline and a match. This was too much for the US ambassador in Vietnam, who determined that Diem had become a liability.
Do you
the US
think?
then supported a coup that ended up killing Diem.
So, all right, he's a liability, the guy that we have propped up and supported. All right, now we're going to turn on him. Let's get somebody else in there.
Kennedy was assassinated a few weeks later, and Lyndon B. Johnson became president. The Viet Cong exploited the power vacuum and increased aggression in South Vietnam. They even sank an American ship moored on the Saigon River. During a storm on August 4th, US ships at the Gulf of Tonkin claimed to be under attack by the North Vietnamese while in international waters. As a response, Congress authorized the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Johnson to increase military presence in Vietnam.
This is, there's a lot of parallels here, obviously, between what happens in the Gulf of Tonkin and the USS Maine in 1898, which is blamed on Spain, even though it was almost certainly an internal explosion. Obviously you have the fire at the Reichstag. You have all these situations where something may or may not have been what it really was, but it regardless was used as a pretext for war.
We now know that there was no real attack on US ships, but whether it was an honest mistake due to a system malfunction or if it was a deliberate lie to escalate involvement in Vietnam remains unknown.
And this is the problem with many of those things I just mentioned, is that it's really almost impossible to say whether it was really misunderstood or if it was deliberately spun. It was spun either way, and it was certainly used to their advantage.
It is now 1965, and the Pentagon estimated that there are between 20 and 100,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnam soldiers present in the South. LBJ wanted to avoid an escalation with China and the Soviet Union, so he decided to start off with small attacks and increase the strength as needed. To intimidate the North into surrendering, LBJ authorized a series of bombing raids just north of the 17th parallel. Then, in Operation Rolling Thunder, American planes bombed key military infrastructure. Hey, I know that you guys are kind of getting wrecked by our airstrikes, so I'll offer you a deal. I'll call off Rolling Thunder and initiate a massive aid deal for the North if you agree to stop supporting the Viet Cong and recognize the South as an independent, non-communist state. Okay. Wait, really? No. Rolling Thunder failed to achieve its goal. In June 1965, the Viet Cong overwhelmed several regiments of the Southern Army, including 3 US-trained Ranger battalions, and captured the provincial capital at Dong Xoai, just 60 miles from Saigon. To add to the chaos, there was another coup in Saigon. With South Vietnam in such a fragile state, President Johnson now had to choose between losing Vietnam and sending American troops.
This is where you're going to start getting into that whole sunk cost fallacy. We've put so much into this already. Do we give up now or do we escalate? And he chooses escalation.
You may be able to guess what he chose to do. The American army took control of the battles and relegated the ARVN to improving relations in the countryside. But the South Vietnamese were not pleased with being shunted aside while Americans took over the war. Besides, they were prone to corruption and violence, which often undermined the purpose of the operation. The country didn't have the infrastructure to support such a large military operation, so the US had to build it themselves. With thousands of American troops arriving in Vietnam, Rolling Thunder now focused on bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to cut off the Viet Cong supply lines. But the North, with a lot of help from China and the Soviet Union, was getting very good at defending their skies, and their anti-aircraft system was becoming formidable. On April 3, 1965, the Northern Air Force intercepted the US bombing of the Tan Hoa Bridge in one of the war's first air-to-air engagements. Although they lost all their planes, the Vietnamese did manage to take down 2 supersonic American warplanes in a dogfight. The message was clear. The North was not going to let the Americans control the skies without a fight. During Operation Starlight, the US launched a surprise attack on a Viet Cong position at the village of Van Tong. The Vietnamese fought ferociously, and although they were defeated and lost 600 fighters, the US also took hundreds of casualties. Americans got another costly victory at Ia Drang, where 3 North Army divisions tried to cut South Vietnam in half. The Americans were beginning to grasp the magnitude of the casualties.
So, if you're familiar with Ia Drang, if you've ever seen the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, it's a really, really good movie. That tells that story. That's the U.S. 7th Cavalry. It's the same unit that Custer in his last stand at Little Bighorn. That was the 7th Cavalry. Hal Moore, who now has one of the big military bases that was renamed from one of the Confederate generals to to a U.S. general, is named after Hal Moore now. So Ia Drang is that battle
they would face.
All right, so I learned a lot there, but like I said, this is not an area that I know a ton about, so I would love to hear from some of you. Let's have a conversation. If you feel like you want to push back against what maybe seems like a very anti-U.S. bias, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it did seem very one-sided, but maybe the situation was that one-sided. And it is always interesting to hear from somebody who's not an American to tell these stories, because obviously if an American was telling it, you'd probably have a very pro-American bias. So we all have biases. It's important to acknowledge those and hear other viewpoints. So we'll come back tomorrow with part 2. Hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon. Thanks for watching.